maybe some sharpened stakes at the bottom, or a bunch of poisonous snakes, or a jaguar down there. They probably work as protection, or at least for a while. And then in the studies, we're interested in what we call energetics, is how much labor went into moving the earth to create these things. And if they were defensive and had palisades, what are the implications of that? One thing we noticed in some of them is my machete guys are clearing the path. We walk down through the ditches to map them with the GPS, is that the machete go ding, ding, kind of a real loud sound like it's hitting something really hard. And it's hitting rock. And most of this is dug through dirt. But many of the deeper ones, the last 3 or 4 feet in some cases like this, is rock they're cutting through with probably wooden tools. Now, it's not granite, it's not, super dense material, it's kind of crumbly, but still, incredible amounts of effort. Now, my artist hasn't done me a great image like this, but I'm taking from some of my colleagues who work in the Mississippi Valley, a palisaded reconstruction of a large settlement. So you can see, you can kind of get a sense here, and below is one of the ditches that we've mapped, one of our second, third largest. It covers about a square kilometer, about a half a square mile of area. And so you think of the number of posts that we needed if you encircled this. And then we know from early Spanish accounts like this of Tupinamba villages, I should be French, of a palisaded village with guys practicing their bows and arrows, fighting each other there. There's a schematic thing, and all these stumps out there. And so it doesn't do any good to build a palisade wall if your enemies can sneak right up behind the trees, right? So you're probably clearing what technically would be sort of a fire zone, at least probably the distance of you shoot arrows around it, if it's going to serve a defensive feature. So cutting trees down. Okay, well, we have chainsaws, we use all kinds of equipment, and these peoples did not have steel axes or iron axes or any axes except for stone axes. And these things are not as efficient as our modern axes. My first archaeology class was experimental archaeology. We cut down a tree, we kind of bashed a tree down using an old one that had been decommissioned from the museum. And you can do it. Oh, it's a lot of work. And so some experiments, and also done here at Penn actually, and some ethnographic data about how much time it takes to cut trees down. And so for a medium-sized ring ditch, it would take to clear the area that enclosed the ditch and some kind of a zone around it to appreciate it or for defense. It would be just to cut the trees down with stone axes would be 42,000 person days. We're using 5 hours as a day. Just throw out some figures real quick here to get it. So digging the ditch, I thought that was going to be the most difficult, and we did lots of experiments with the raised fields of putting them back into use, carefully recording how much dirt a person can move in a typical day. And so for that same ditch, it would probably be about 15,000 person days, a little bit less than the actual clearing of the trees. Well, if they had to move the trees, so if it was forest before they built these things, the trees are right there. They cut them down, they're ready to use. But if these, as we expect, were fields and maybe overgrown forests, secondary forests, they might have had to move logs long distances. Now, they could have done this during the rainy season using the rivers, sort of skimming them across the flooded savannas, but still, it would have been a lot of work. Tropical areas, palisade posts don't last very long. So you've got to, if you need this thing for 20, 30 years, you're going to have to probably redo it. So we looked at things like how, if the palisade posts were relatively close to each other, how many posts would you need for, a typical ditch? And so we, from the Spanish accounts, there were some sort of shooting slits between the posts so they could shoot their arrows and stuff and protect themselves. And you could probably, out of a typical tropical tree, get 2 posts that were high enough. And we have some Spanish descriptions of the actual height of these and how deeply they were buried in the colonial forts. And so clearing of the forest and the excavation of ditch for a small, medium-sized one would be almost 58,000 person days. And there are hundreds of these things. This is one dense concentration we have in the Bowery's area. So the white areas are ditches, and the dark areas are sort of partial ditches that are associated with them. We don't know if all these were in use at one time, but they're within stone's throw distance of each other. Why did they need so many of these things? And come back to this idea, these peoples were probably under threat from most likely the Tupi-speaking peoples. These are probably Arawak peoples. So what do we know about these connections in these villages and stuff? Are they just protecting themselves, or are they all kind of working together? So the fact that these ditch phenomena is kind of widespread, there's certain kinds of stylistic similarities in terms of size and scale, that we think they're probably working kind of together and coordinating a lot of this. And they're doing it through the roadways that I showed you, the connections across waterways, some of these artificial. So I had a student, a master's student, help me in this mindless work of staring at a computer screen and drawing any straight line we could find between the forest islands. So this, and the lime green here are the forest islands in one small area, and then those orange and blue lines are different sizes of causeways and canals connecting them. I think we gave up to several thousand we counted. But this enabled us to then do some statistical analyses. And so he found a program called network analysis. Now it's kind of common use. But in the past, it was used to cite shopping malls, the best location where you have the most number of roadways and highest populations. You predict the best place to seat these things. And it can be used for archaeological purposes to tell something about, are all these connections across this landscape to integrate, or is there a lot of autonomy expressed by this, by the number of connections you see here between what we call nodes. And so he ran this program several times and came up with a whole bunch of incredible data. So this shows what we call degree of centrality. And so the darker areas there are the ones that have more connections to them. And I thought it's got to be right in the middle of this mass of stuff. There'd be a capital or something. There is one down here on the end, and those blue ones are a little bit larger. So they're kind of scattered out. So it kind of argues against maybe being all centralized, but certainly a cosmopolitan people that are interacting with each other. So who are these peoples? Well, we know from the early eyewitness accounts, there were many different language groups. They fought with each other in some cases. They had huge villages, up to 10,000 in some cases, very powerful chiefs. In some of these societies, that can mobilize lots of labor and warriors in times of need. And the Spanish described them as having, in many cases, gold and silver, which is not local. It probably came from the Incas, from the Andean region, but a very prosperous society. My Brazilian colleagues have been doing a lot of work and actually some excavations in their phenomenon of geoglyphs. And so they have now about 400 of these have been mapped in the state of Acre, which borders with Bolivia, in the area where I work. And you can see some of the different sizes and shapes here. And if you sort of kind of look at the distribution of these, they also extend in the area I showed you earlier in the talk with Michael Heckenberger in the upper Xingu, that it has this area we call Western Amazonia. And we're not arguing that it's a state, that it's some kind of civilization, but they're interacting intensely with each other, sharing a lot of things, and a lot of this has to do with earthwork. So we don't find any kind of concentration elsewhere in the Amazonia or even in the Americas, except for the Incas. And my colleague Mike Heckenberger sort of drew these kind of little silly lens-shaped diagrams here, but he's trying to show here what he calls interactive spheres in Amazonia. And these are areas that he can define by pottery similarities, linguistic similarities, and what we know from the ethnographic and historical record and the archaeological record, that these are probably groups that are interacting more with themselves than the other areas that are marked here. But if you look at the scale of these are on par with anything you'd find in the Maya area, the Mississippi River here, the civilizations here, or in the Andean region, and dwarf in some cases what we see as early states in Mesopotamia and China and other parts of the world. We're not arguing that they're the same in any way, but certainly units that are much more than autonomous villages. And we know now from the raised fields that they're able to do incredible production. So in summary, I focused on a particular form of earthwork and showed the ring ditches are monumental in terms of labor invested in their construction and maintenance. One important question is, what impact did the construction, in particular massive deforestation, of these landscape features have on the environment, and specifically biodiversity? Ecological surveys of the region of the forest islands where the ring ditches are found have some of the highest biodiversity in the Bolivian Amazon. The same forest islands that are rich in economic species of plants and animals are still harvested sustainably by local communities, such as chocolate that I showed you. Native peoples transformed what was a relatively homogeneous savanna and turned it into a terraformed cultural landscape of fields, canals, reservoirs, fish weirs in some cases, and these geoglyphs. They also, in these humanized landscapes, it have something to do with these present-day resources, despite the massive deforestation required for the construction of these, whether they were forts, palisaded, or not. This isn't simply a forest recovering after the removal of native peoples from these landscapes due to war, disease, slavery, and relocation by Europeans. Like most Westerners, I appreciate trees, and I'm sure all of you do too. When I hear a chainsaw in my neighborhood of Bala-Cynwyd, I cringe, and I open the door to see where it's coming from, what big tree is coming down, and it just hurts me to see trees come down. But after working in the Bolivian Amazon for a number of years, I've come to appreciate a different kind of environmental aesthetic. For native peoples today, local farmers and ranchers, and probably the inhabitants of the past, a clean, wide-open landscape of savanna is probably more valued than forests. They manage these through continual, annual, intensive burning to keep the forest at bay, and created what their version of a proper cultural, orderly landscape. Cultural landscapes are records of the people without history, the 99% of the people living in the past who we don't read about. Most of the accounts we have that are written from societies come from documents about the elites. And even though the reading of these landscapes is subtle, in some cases not so subtle, as you see in these landscapes, they're the signatures of productive human activity, and these pre-Columbian communities, we argue, should be given credit for their accomplishments, knowledge, engineering, heritage, and their monumental works. Thank you.